The night my boss fired me, he said two words. Two words. Flat. Bored. The way a man cancels a coffee order. Not the way a person ends 15 years of someone's professional life. He checked his watch while he said them. Like he had somewhere more interesting to be. And in exactly 8 minutes, the most expensive logistics system in our company's history was going to begin collapsing. He did not know that yet. But I did. My name is Colton Pierce, 47 years old, former Marine, lead systems architect at CoreFlow Industries for a decade and a half. I was not the kind of employee who showed up in company newsletters or got featured in board presentations. I did not give TED Talks. I did not own a sticker-covered laptop or talk about disruption at all-hands meetings. I wore the same worn work boots every day, kept a cigarette behind my ear that I had not actually lit in 3 years, and maintained a notebook full of technical warnings that executives routinely described as too detailed to be useful. What I did was keep the company alive. Not in a dramatic way. Not in any way most people would ever notice. I kept it alive the same way a good mechanic keeps a vehicle running. Quietly. Consistently. With the deep, unglamorous knowledge that comes from understanding every part of a system well enough to hear when something is about to fail. CoreFlow was not a small operation anymore. What started as one man, Preston Walsh, with a single delivery truck and an old folding desk in a Phoenix garage, had grown into a global shipping infrastructure moving pharmaceuticals, frozen food, electronics, industrial parts, medical devices, and high-value freight across continents, trucks on American highways, containers in Rotterdam, refrigerated pharmaceutical loads at the Port of Long Beach, temperature-sensitive biologics waiting at Shanghai's customs checkpoint for routing confirmation that came, silently and reliably, from the system I had spent 15 years building. That system was not glamorous either. It was a web of databases, redundancies, safety checks, authentication keys, backup mounts, manual override locks, and emergency isolation procedures that most executives could not pronounce, let alone understand. To a man like Wade Foster, my boss of 2 years and one of the most confidently incompetent people I had ever encountered in a professional setting, it looked like old-fashioned obstruction. Wade loved 3 things: expensive suits, corporate language, and the sound of his own certainty. He had never written a clean line of code in his life. He had, however, attended 12 leadership summits, was fond of phrases like next-generation synergy and frictionless transformation, and believed, with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences, that the future of technology belonged to people who moved fast, which was why he had hired his niece. Lindsay Foster was 24 years old. She had completed an 8-week coding boot camp, maintained a LinkedIn profile full of words like digital transformation, workflow disruption, and agile innovation. And the week before, the night I am describing, had asked me in complete seriousness whether Python had anything to do with actual snakes. That was the person Wade had decided would take over Project Phoenix. I need you to understand what Phoenix was, because this story does not make sense without it. Project Phoenix was not an app update. It was not a dashboard redesign. It was not some internal productivity tool that only affected office schedules and meeting room bookings. Project Phoenix was the central nervous system of CoreFlow's entire global shipping operation. It connected warehouse management systems in 9 countries, refrigerated container tracking from Los Angeles to Singapore, live customs data feeds across 4 major port authorities, pharmaceutical routing protocols that were legally required to maintain a continuous chain of custody, truck fleet GPS integrations across 2 continents, and client-facing delivery tracking portals used by hospitals, cold chain medical suppliers, and industrial manufacturers who needed real-time confirmation that their cargo existed and was moving. If Phoenix worked, CoreFlow would become faster and more accurate than any competitor in their market. If Phoenix failed, A refrigerated truck carrying insulin could sit at a loading dock with no routing data. A container of biologics could lose temperature monitoring for 4 hours and turn into medical waste. Hospitals could stop receiving supply confirmations. Clients could lose millions. Regulators could open investigations. And every single minute of downtime would cost the company more money than Wade spent on a month of suits. That was why I had built Phoenix carefully. Wade called it slowly. Wade was wrong about a lot of things. He first told me Lindsay would be taking over Phoenix on a Monday morning. I was in the middle of reviewing a critical integration patch. Half a cup of cold coffee going stale on the desk beside me, when he walked into the server room looking like he had just come from a photo shoot. He smiled the way people smile when they have already made a decision and are only telling you as a courtesy. I told him what would happen. I walked him through the pressure points, the load balancing protocols that kept 5 regional routing systems synchronized, the integrity checks that prevented corrupted data from cascading through the transaction logs, the backup validation layers that I had spent 3 months building specifically because I had seen what happened when those layers did not exist. I explained it clearly, and I explained it more than once. He listened the way powerful people listen when they have no intention of changing anything. Politely, distantly, with that faint look of pity that men like Wade reserve for people they find exhausting. Then he told me I was engaging in fear-based thinking. I remember standing there for a moment. Not because I was shocked, but because I was trying to decide if there was any version of that phrase that made sense in the context of what I had just explained. There was not. Fear-based thinking. That was what he called 15 years of documented, tested, hard-won infrastructure experience. That was what he called the very protocols that had kept his company from being ransomed, hacked, corrupted, and sued on at least 4 separate occasions that I could name off the top of my head. That was what he called the boring, essential, invisible work that does not look like anything is happening right up until the moment it stops. And then everything starts happening at once. I asked him one final question. I asked him who was going to explain to the pharmaceutical clients why their temperature-sensitive shipments lost monitoring. He straightened his tie. He said Lindsay would handle it. And then, on a Tuesday night at 10:47, 3 days before the biggest system launch in CoreFlow's history, he came back to the server room and told me I was fired. Heath from security stood in the doorway behind him, clearly miserable about it. Heath was a good man. He had a wife dealing with medical bills and a kid who needed orthodontic work. He did not want to escort me out of a building I had spent 15 years in. He just wanted to keep his job. I did not hold it against him. Wade, on the other hand, delivered the news the way you say goodbye to someone you have already forgotten. Effective immediately. He did not look at the monitors. He did not look at the open patch still sitting uncommitted in the command line. He did not look at the 3 screens of live diagnostics showing the exact pressure points of a system 3 days from going live. He looked at his Apple Watch. For a moment I thought about the mortgage, the health insurance card in my wallet that would stop functioning the moment I walked out of the building, my daughter's college tuition. At 47, being fired is not a career inconvenience. It is a financial cliff edge. Then I took one slow breath and thought about something else. I thought about the uncommitted patch still sitting in memory. I thought about the warning flags I had been tracking for 2 straight weeks. I thought about the fact that Lindsay was going to be sitting in that chair inside of 7 hours. I thought about the manual override options on the sharding controls and how obvious a temptation they would be to someone who did not understand what they were for. I thought about exactly how long the system would hold before it stopped smiling and started screaming. And then I picked up my cardboard box, nodded at Heath, and walked toward the elevator. Because Wade had made a decision. Wade got to live with it. I almost made it out. That was the part nobody in that boardroom would have predicted. For one long elevator ride down, I had almost let it happen. Not out of revenge. Not out of spite. Because they had fired me. And some part of my brain, the tired, cynical part that had spent 15 years being dismissed by men in expensive suits, said very quietly that this was no longer my problem. Then I remembered my access card. Still on my desk. Still upstairs. Still, the only thing standing between my truck and the parking garage gate. Heath went tight in the jaw when I pointed that out. So we went back up. And that is when everything changed. The elevator doors opened onto the 20th floor, and I heard music. Not the quiet hum of an operations floor 3 days from a critical launch. Not keyboards and server fans and the specific focused silence of engineers doing serious work. Music. Some glossy, thumping electronic pop track bouncing off the glass walls like the space had been booked for a personal celebration. Lindsay was sitting in my chair, feet tucked underneath her, iced coffee in one hand, sticker-covered laptop open beside the console she had pushed sideways to make room. She had turned the primary monitor to a slightly different angle. And the main dashboard, which I had left on the diagnostic command interface, was now showing the vendor-side visual interface. The shiny one, the colorful one, the one designed for executives who wanted to feel like they understood what was happening without actually needing to understand anything. I noticed the stickers on her laptop before I noticed the error on the screen. Girl boss. Coffee and code. Disrupt everything. That last one lodged in my chest like a splinter. Then I looked at the monitor behind her. In the upper right corner, blinking in red, was a notification I had never wanted to see on a live system. Database sharding. Manual override active. For 1 second. The music disappeared. The iced coffee disappeared. The stickers and the chair and even the fact that I had been fired 3 hours ago disappeared. All I saw was that blinking red text. Manual override active meant the database was no longer checking itself. The load balancing inhibitors, the controls that kept data moving evenly and safely across the sharded architecture, had been turned off. The system was now pushing live cargo information through a single overloaded path. It was still moving. It was still green on the surface. It was even loading slightly faster. Because it had stopped doing the work that made it safe. It was a car doing 80 miles an hour with the seatbelts cut out. Lindsay spun around when she noticed us and gave me the kind of bright, unconcerned smile that belongs on a face that has never been responsible for consequences. "Oh. Is this Colton?" she chirped. "Wade said you were leaving. Totally a bummer. But honestly, fresh starts." "Right." I did not answer her. I was looking at the warning. "Lindsay," I said, very carefully, "what did you do to the sharding protocols?" She waved her hand like I had asked about a weather setting. "Oh. Those?" They were giving me these super annoying latency warnings. And all the integrity checks were making the dashboard way slower. So I just turned off the blockers. I looked at her. "You disabled the load balancing inhibitors." "I optimized them." "No," I said. "You disabled the brakes." She rolled her eyes. "Colton, Wade literally told me you do this. You make everything sound like the end of the world. Look at the loading bar. It's moving so much faster now." She was right about the loading bar. That was the terrifying part. Healthy systems do not suddenly double in speed because a person with 6 weeks of access clicks a few buttons. When a system that size appears to accelerate overnight, it usually means it has stopped checking whether the data passing through it is clean, consistent, or real. The faster it moves, the more damage it is doing in silence. Bad data moves through unchecked. Transaction logs begin desyncing. The authentication keys attached to backup mounts start rejecting. I stepped toward the monitor. The diagnostic panel showed exactly what I had been afraid of. Cache memory was rising fast. The system was accepting requests it should have been queuing. It was writing to protected space it should never have touched. The integrity layer had been blind for, I estimated quickly, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. I did not have time to be angry about that. "Lindsay," I said, keeping my voice level, "step away from the keyboard." She laughed nervously. "You are so dramatic." "Behind me," Heath said quietly. "Colton, we really need to go." I looked at the clock. I looked at the loading bar still speeding through its beautiful, meaningless performance. Asian markets opened in just under 3 hours. I picked up my phone. There was one person in the building hierarchy who still had the authority and the intelligence to act. Preston Walsh had built this company from a truck and a phone. He did not always understand the technical details, but he understood consequences. He understood that when someone who had been right for 15 years sent a message at 11 o'clock at night, it was worth reading. I typed it fast. System crash in 8 minutes. Asian markets in 3 hours. Good luck with the fresh thinking. Then I picked up my box and I walked back to the elevator. Because if Preston Walsh chose to ignore that message, there was nothing more I could do. And if he did not, he would know where to find me. The reply came before the elevator reached the lobby. Don't leave the building. 5 minutes out. Then, a second later, wait for me. I set my cardboard box down on the leather couch near the reception desk and sat with my hands loose in my lap and the weight of 15 years pressing quietly against the back of my ribs. Ashley, the night receptionist, was frowning at her computer. That's weird, she said. My email just froze. I looked at the clock behind her desk. 11:04 in the evening. Right on time. At 11:05. The phone switchboard lit up like a fire alarm. Every line. All at once. Ashley grabbed the headset. Punched buttons. Frowned deeper. Static on every channel. The global shipping display screen behind her desk, which I had walked past 1,000 times without really looking at it, began flickering. The green routing lines that usually moved across it in clean, steady pulses started turning yellow. Then one turned red. Then 3 more. The stairwell door crashed open. Shane Sullivan came stumbling into the lobby with one hand pressed to his chest and an expression on his face that I recognized as the exact look of a man who has just watched something he helped build start actively dying. Shane was one of our better junior developers. Smart, thorough, slightly asthmatic when stressed, which meant right now he was breathing like he had run a sprint through smoke. Heath. Is Colton here? Please tell me Colton is here. Heath pointed at me. Shane nearly knocked over a potted plant getting to the couch. Colton. He was gulping air between words. The staging environment went down. Production started throwing authentication errors 3 minutes ago. Backups are not mounting. Asian distribution nodes are rejecting routing instructions. The gateway is choking. Wade is screaming at everyone. And Lindsay is sitting in the corner crying and refusing to touch anything. I nodded slowly. Someone disabled the safety interlocks to improve the loading speed. Shane's face went the color of new paper. She said they were creating unnecessary friction. Of course she did. Colton. If we're still down when Asian markets open, the pharmaceutical routing contracts alone could. $200,000 a minute. I said, conservative estimate. Before liability. Before spoiled shipments. Before regulatory review. Before client attorneys make phone calls. He put both hands over his face. Then the revolving door opened. Preston Walsh walked in from the cold night air. Tie loose. Hair undone. Phone lighting up in his hand every few seconds with notifications and alerts. He did not look like the composed CEO who appeared in board presentations and annual reports. He looked like a man who had just been told the building he built was on fire. But his eyes were clear. When Preston Walsh was truly focused, there was something in his face that cut through everything else. He had built CoreFlow from zero. He had made payroll by hand in lean years. He had driven trucks himself when drivers called out sick. He understood what infrastructure failure felt like, not as a financial abstraction, but as a physical reality. He walked past Ashley, past the screaming phones, past Shane still standing with his hands over his face, and stopped directly in front of me. You knew this would happen, he said. I predicted it. I said, there's a difference. How bad? Catastrophic if we don't move immediately. His jaw tightened. Can you fix it? That was the question. I had been waiting for that question without knowing I was waiting for it. And now that it was in front of me, I looked at it honestly for a moment. Because here was the truth, I could probably fix it. I had designed the system. I understood every failsafe and every weak point. I had hidden backups inside backups specifically for the possibility that someone would do exactly what Lindsay had done. I had spent 3 years quietly installing a legacy recovery protocol that I had named, with the private humor of a man who knew he would never get credit for it, Colton is paranoid, v. 4.2. But fixing the technical failure was one thing. Fixing the decision that caused it was another. If I walked back in there and repaired the damage tonight without addressing the root problem would still be there tomorrow. Wade would still be there. Lindsay would still have administrator access. And the next time something broke, I would not be in the building at all. That depends, I said, standing up. Are we talking about fixing the servers? Or fixing the problem that broke them? Preston looked at me. Walk with me, he said. The elevator ride was quiet. Preston did not speak until the doors opened onto the 20th floor and the full scope of the disaster came into view. Engineers were moving in short, panicked bursts between workstations. Error messages glowed red through the glass walls of the command center. On the far side of the room, Wade was standing with his arms spread wide, speaking in the loud, confident voice of a man trying to project authority he no longer had. He was explaining to 2 senior engineers that this was clearly a coordinated cyber attack. Probably foreign. Very sophisticated. And that someone in the department had almost certainly opened a phishing email. Lindsay was in the corner, iced coffee on the floor beside her. Forgotten. Mascara running. She had curled into the chair the way people curl when the weight of something they have done finally becomes physically real. Preston pushed open the command center door. The room went silent instantly. Wade's face flooded with relief when he saw Preston. He opened his mouth. Preston spoke first. This was not a cyber attack. Wade blinked. Preston crossed the room to the main console, and I reached past him to pull up the access log. Lindsay's username glowed in white text against the black background, time-stamped beside every safety protocol she had disabled. Load balancing inhibitors, integrity validation checks, backup mount authentication, manual override confirmation. The log was a complete record of every break she had pulled out, with her name attached to each one. In the order she had done it. Preston turned the screen toward the room. This is what happened, he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. This is not a cyber attack. This is what happens when leadership ignores the expertise of the people who built the systems and hands critical access to someone who is not qualified to hold it. Every engineer in that room saw it. Every manager saw it. And Wade saw it too. His expensive suit did not help him in that moment. His favorite phrases had nowhere to go. The entire architecture of his professional credibility had been quietly dismantled by a single access log with his niece's name on it. He started to speak twice. Both times, he stopped. Then he tried a third time. Preston, this is unfair. Lindsay was implementing a modernization strategy that Lindsay was disabling the infrastructure that keeps $30 million in temperature-sensitive medical cargo safely routed. Preston said, while the engineer you fired tonight was sitting in the lobby waiting to tell someone what was about to happen. The room had the particular silence of people watching something irreversible occur. Preston turned to me. Colton has full authority. Starting now. Wade's mouth fell open. You cannot be serious. He was terminated. He is a terminated employee, standing in a restricted area. And you, Preston said, his voice dropping into something that was not quite anger and was much more dangerous than anger, are relieved of duty. Effective, immediately. Lindsay looked up from her corner, but Uncle Wade said I was going to be the lead architect. I walked to the console without looking at her. You are not an architect, I said quietly. You pulled the brakes out of a moving vehicle and called it speed. That is not architecture. That is damage. She did not respond. Maybe that landed. Maybe it did not. It was not my problem either way. I looked at my team. Shane, still breathing hard. Nicole, who had been desperately trying to isolate the gateway on her own. Bryce, who had copied every raw transaction log he could access before the cascade got worse. Good engineers. Steady people who had been handed a disaster they had no part in creating. I sat down at the console and rolled up my sleeves. Shane, I need a direct terminal connection to the primary cluster. Already open? He said. Nicole, kill every external gateway. Nothing comes in. Nothing goes out until I say so. Done. Bryce, mirror every transaction log raw before you do anything else with them. Do not parse. Do not filter. Just copy. He nodded hard. I looked up at Preston. I need root access to everything. Full permissions. No restrictions. He looked at me for 1 second. You have it. I turned back to the console. The cursor blinked on the black screen like it had been waiting. Sometimes you have to stop a system completely to save it. That is a principle most people find counterintuitive. Because stopping feels like the opposite of fixing. But in a critical system under cascade failure, the worst thing you can do is keep it running. Every second it runs, it is writing corrupted data to places that will be harder to clean later. It is making the recovery longer and more expensive. It is burning itself from the inside while still appearing. To anyone watching the surface metrics, to be functional, you have to stop the heart before you can restart it properly. I issued the command. The screens went black. The server fans spun down to quiet. The room held its breath. And then, in the silence, a single line of green text appeared on the main monitor. System reboot initiated. Checking integrity. Legacy failsafe protocol detected. Colton is paranoid v4.2. Preston leaned toward the screen. What is that? That? I said, allowing myself one quiet exhale. Is the safety net that Wade asked me to remove 18 months ago because it was, and I am quoting him directly, redundant legacy drag on dashboard loading performance. Bryce made a sound that was half laugh, half disbelief. You kept it. I buried it. I said, it runs an immutable background process that regenerates every 6 hours. It does not appear in any visible diagnostic panel. It does not slow down any metric that Wade or anyone else was measuring. It just exists. Quietly. For exactly this situation, green text continued cascading down the screen. Transaction logs rebuilding. Authentication keys restoring. Regional routing nodes reconnecting. Backup mounts accepting. Gateway isolation holding. At exactly 100%, every monitor in the command center came back to life. The global shipping map turned green. Every routing line, every container, every warehouse node, every pharmaceutical tracking confirmation. Green across the board. The pending orders that had been stacking up during the outage surged. Processed the backlog in under 40 seconds. And settled into normal operational parameters. The system was not just stable. It was running better than it had in months. Because the forced reboot had flushed 3 years of accumulated cache garbage that I had never had a maintenance window long enough to clear properly. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Shane made a sound I will never forget. It was not a cheer. It was more like the sound a person makes when they have been holding their breath underwater and finally reached the surface. I leaned back in the chair. Preston looked at the screens for a long time. How long have you had that failsafe installed? 3 years. Did anyone know? Nobody who would have approved it. I said. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then, slowly, something that might have been a smile crossed his face. Not happy. Exactly. Something harder than that. The expression of a man who has just been shown, very clearly, the gap between the company he thought he was running and the company that was actually running. Get some rest, he said. Board meeting at 7 in the morning. He turned to Heath, who had somehow ended up in the doorway of the command center. looking like a man watching a trial he had been subpoenaed to witness. "Please see, Mr. Foster and his niece out of the building." Wade opened his mouth. "You will be hearing from my attorney," he said. "And you," Preston said, "will be hearing from the board when they review a detailed account of why you gave administrator access to an unqualified family member and then terminated the engineer who warned you what would happen." Wade closed his mouth. He took Lindsay by the arm, and they walked out of the command center with every pair of eyes in the room following them. No argument. No speech. Just silence. The kind that follows something that cannot be undone. I watched the green monitors for a long time after the room quieted down. The global map pulsed steadily. Trucks on their routes. Containers at their checkpoints. Temperature monitors holding green on refrigerated loads from Los Angeles to Shanghai. Somewhere out there, drivers who had never heard my name were following routing instructions that had come back to their screens after a silence that could have lasted for hours. They would never know how close it had come. That was fine. They did not need to know. I opened my desk drawer, out of habit more than anything, and found the coffee mug my daughter had given me years ago. She had bought it herself, with her own small amount of money, and presented it to me with the total confidence of a child who had identified a true thing about her father. Dad fixes everything. I held that mug for a long moment. Then I poured my coffee and sat back down in the chair that had, at some point in the past few hours, stopped being the chair I had been escorted away from and returned to being mine. The board meeting happened at 7 in the morning. I had slept 3 hours on the couch in the break room, still wearing the same clothes, with a cold cup of coffee on the table and the steady hum of stable servers somewhere below me. I walked into that boardroom unshaved and probably not completely presentable, and I sat down next to Preston Walsh, while 12 people in expensive clothes stared at a crisis report that had been assembled, at high speed, by Preston's executive assistant, who had been awake since 2 in the morning. Nobody made a joke. Nobody said innovation. Nobody mentioned moving fast. For the first time in a long time, the people in that room with the glass wall and the long table and the filtered water and the view of downtown Phoenix were listening to the man with the coffee stains on his shirt. Preston stood. "Project Phoenix is stable," he said. "The launch will proceed under revised control procedures. Wade Foster and Lindsay Foster are no longer with the company." He let that sit. Then he looked at me. "Effective immediately. Colton Pierce is appointed Chief Security Officer. Full authority over all critical infrastructure, system changes, and technical personnel approvals. Any modification to core systems requires his sign-off. No exceptions." The room turned toward me. One of the board directors, a woman named Patricia who had been at CoreFlow since the early years, cleared her throat. "Mr. Pierce, can you guarantee this will not happen again?" I looked at her steadily. "No," I said. A few people shifted in their chairs. "What I can guarantee is this. Nobody gets administrator access to production systems because of a family relationship. Nobody removes safety protocols because a loading screen feels slow. Nobody calls experienced legacy drag and then hands a critical deployment to someone who cannot tell you what a database shard is. Not while I am in this building." Nobody argued. Not one word. Because the room was full of people who had just been shown, with the precise clarity of a 12-hour crisis, exactly what happened when they chose Flash over competence. The official paperwork came 2 days later. Preston walked it into my office himself, sat across the desk, slid the folder over. Salary adjustment, equity package. A formal letter of apology from CoreFlow Industries acknowledging that my termination had been wrongful and that the company recognized the significant harm it had nearly caused by acting on it. I read the letter once. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer. "The engineers," I said. "Shane, Nicole, Bryce. I want salary reviews for all 3. They held that room together for 2 hours before I got back upstairs." Preston nodded. Done. And the safety documentation I have been submitting for 3 years. The stuff that keeps getting flagged as too technical for leadership review. I want a process where it gets a real response. Another nod. Done. I leaned back. Then we're good. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and paused at the door. You know, he said, not quite looking at me. I should have listened to you 18 months ago. I thought about saying something gracious. I thought about saying something wise. Then I thought about the access card I had left on my desk, and the music I had heard when the elevator opened, and the red warning in the corner of the monitor, and the 8 minutes I had spent sitting in the lobby counting down to the exact moment a system I had built, protected, and been fired away from had begun to fail. Yes, I said, you should have. Preston almost smiled. Then he left. I went back to the server room. My server room. The hum was the same as it had always been. Steady. Patient. Exactly what it was supposed to be. The monitors showed green across the global map. Every line of data moving calmly through the architecture I had spent 15 years building and protecting and refusing to cut corners on. Even when cutting corners would have made my life considerably quieter. I sat down in my chair. I thought about Wade standing in that same room, checking his Apple Watch, telling me I was too slow. I thought about Lindsay with her iced coffee and her stickers. Her certainty that speed was the same thing as intelligence, and that disabling a safety check was the same thing as improving a system. I thought about all the people who had ever looked at careful work and called it fear. There is something people like Wade never understood, and maybe never will. Experience is not the enemy of progress. Caution is not weakness. Slow does not mean stupid. Sometimes slow is the reason the bridge does not collapse. Sometimes methodical is the reason the medicine reaches the hospital on time. Sometimes the person everyone calls outdated is the only person in the building who knows exactly where the danger is buried and why it needs to stay exactly where it is. Sometimes the most important thing you can build is the thing no one ever sees. Because it only matters when everything else fails. I raised the mug toward the monitors. Too slow. I said quietly, right. The servers hummed back, steady and calm and green across every line. And somewhere out there, in the pre-dawn dark of a continent I had never visited, a truck driver whose name I would never know followed a route that appeared reliably on his screen and drove through the night toward a destination that someone was waiting for. He never knew how close that route had come to disappearing. That was fine. Some things are built to be invisible. That is the whole point. Karma does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a red warning on a screen at 11 o'clock at night, and a cardboard box on a lobby couch, and a message sent to the right person at exactly the right moment. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop saving people from the consequences of their own arrogance, and then be ready when they finally ask you to come back. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments what you would have done. Would you have walked out and let it burn? Or would you have sent that message? And if you believe truth always finds its way back, subscribe to Alex's Revenge. We bring you powerful revenge stories every week.